I have another source who has a story, still secondhand unfortunately, but confirms that the gambling ships, in reality, were not nearly as glamorous as they like to portray themselves. In fact, this generous gentleman has a few great stories for us, with insight not just into the gambling ships, but what small-town beach city culture was like in the 1930s. But I should let him introduce himself.
My name is Joe Ditler, and I'm a longtime writer and publicist here in Coronado, and over the past decade I've been kind of handed the unofficial title of Coronado historian. I ran the Coronado Historical Association and Museum for 3 years, and I was editor at Coronado Magazine for another 2 years. And during those 5 years, I think I must have resurrected more Coronado history than anybody in a long time.
Remember, way back in the introduction of the first episode of this series, I talked about the SS Monte Carlo gambling ship crashing up against the shores of Coronado. And if you know your California geography, you might have noticed that Coronado is a peninsula on the west side of the San Diego Bay, about 100 miles south of Long Beach.
They originally were put up along the Los Angeles, Long Beach area for the Olympics to try to capture that crowd, and she had her trials and tribulations up there, and then they brought her down here and put her closer to Mexican waters, closer to Coronado. And there was a district attorney here at the time who had made it his mission in life to stop this activity. He found he was helpless to control what went on aboard the ship, but he could implement such serious taxes and levies and permits on the water taxis that he would put them out of business.
The Monte Carlo owners were sick of the constant harassment by authorities in Long Beach and figured San Diego was closer to Mexico, therefore the people were more familiar with quick trips across the border to Tijuana, therefore maybe they'd be more mellow about this whole sinful behavior thing. However, it turned out they ran into many of the same problems.
One of the things that I discovered in my early research here in Coronado and San Diego is that, from the clippings and so forth, is that every minister in the land was praying to his congregation for God to come down and to strike that floating gambling casino and strike her and make her go away. Apparently a lot of the men in the parishes were not coming to church. They were off gambling, on the ship. So then when the ship finally did get destroyed by an act of God or Mother Nature or whatever, I think every minister in the land took credit for it that next Sunday.
But before we get to the crash of the ship, let's return back to what the ships actually look like. Joe, did you talk to anybody who actually visited the ships?
Yeah, there was a delightful lady here in town. Her name was Catherine Carlin, and she ended up being the founder of the Coronado Historical Association and Museum. And in her twilight years, I remember just going by her house, knocking on her door. Someone had said, Cat Carlin had been on board the Monte Carlo. And, well, I thought this was great. I hadn't heard of anybody else, that had actually been on board. And so I went over and I knocked on her door, and she was so sweet. She sat down on the front steps, and we talked for about an hour. And she didn't have a whole lot of memories. She said it was a date. A young man wanted to take her out, and at the last minute announced to her that he had tickets on the water taxi, and they were going to go visit the gambling casino. So she wasn't sure what to think. She said it was a pretty nauseous ride all the way out and back, a little open boat, and she said a lot of people were throwing up. And they came alongside, and there was a big ladder coming down the side of the ship. And she said she was amazed at how big it was. It was about 300 feet long. And didn't appear to be moving too much, so she thought, well, this looks like it might be fun. She walked up the ladder and got on board, and she said when they went into the big dining room, gambling hall, there were women in little fan dancers, she called them. She said they had skimpy little skirts on, and they were all dancing on the tables, and they looked like they had either been drugged or drunk or both. And she said it smelled awful, like people throwing up, and she said, I'm out of here. And she made her date take her home. So she got on board long enough to make that decision and draw that conclusion, and then she ran for her life. But it was fun hearing her talk about it.
Forgive the expression, but this shit sounds bananas. Drugged girls dancing about, the smell of puke in the air, this is hardly the enchanting pleasure palace resort that I've been reading about from advertisements and flyers. This bears no resemblance to the city of Monte Carlo, which gave the ship its name. Not even Las Vegas. Hell, this makes Reno look fancy. This sounds like some sort of fever dream, like if Caligula ran that dumpy casino that Randy Quaid takes Chevy Chase to in Vegas Vacation. You know, the place where you can bet on rock, paper, scissors?
Dealer has rock. Pay paper.
It is hardly a wonder that so many people wanted this place shut down. So how did all of this end?
That final winter of 1936, she had actually been closed down for a couple of months. And had a couple of caretakers on board, and there was no official traffic, people going out and coming back. And then the storm, of course, New Year's Eve, was one of those century storms, that you hear about. Mm-hmm. And it beat her up pretty badly. And even though she was a cement ship, they had laden her with more cement in the hull, hopefully with the idea being to keep her from moving around too much. And she eventually got up enough motion to go in one way and the other, and she popped her forechain and then her aft chain, and then she was free to move with the currents and the wind, and it's exactly what she did. And she headed straight into Coronado and landed on our beach, where she remains today.
Just as the fire of the Monfalcone brought people down to the shore to witness a spectacle, the people of Coronado woke up on New Year's morning of 1937 and found a spectacle that was close enough to touch.
Encounter with someone who had a Monte Carlo story was a man I worked for as a teenager here in the late 60s, early 70s. His name was Bud Bernard, and he was actually he had a concrete and bricklaying company, and he hired a lot of the local kids, mostly to give us some self-esteem and some cash in our pockets. But Bud was a great storyteller, and in his day he was quite a waterman. He loved the ocean. I remember vividly watching him body surf here in Coronado on 10-foot days when nobody else would dare to go out. Well, Bud, when the ship hit the beach, like everybody else in town, he ran down to the beach, and he had told me the story that a handful of men in long coats and hats, approached him on the north end of the beach and said, son, we'll pay you $20 to swim out there and climb up on that vessel and just do a quick visual survey and tell us what you see out there. Now, Bud was convinced they were the owners of the boat, and that's kind of a crucial point because we never were able to identify who owned the boat until the Marquez book came out. Mm-hmm. But Bud did swim out, and in his own words, he said, boy, there was silver dollars and booze bottles everywhere. And he says, I grabbed an old broken bottle and brought it back into shore and gave it to him. And I said, gee, I'm sorry, this is about all that's out there. And they gave him the $20, and they had a little quick huddle on the beach, and then they got out of there. So we're figuring those were the owners of the ship, or at least the owner's representatives. And for several months after, Bud said he would swim out to that wreck and climb on board and fill his pant pockets with silver dollars and then come back home. And he claims he had gotten hundreds of dollars doing that and continued to do so until it got too dangerous. But one day he said his mother caught him emptying his sandy pockets out, silver dollars on his bed. She thought he had stolen the money, and no matter what he said, every time he tried to tell her what happened, she would smack him across the head and accuse him of being a thief, and this is not how we brought you up, and your admiral father would be so upset. And eventually Bud was able to convince her the story was true, and she sat back and thought about it for a second, and then she said, well, is there any more money out there? Well, go back down. And, he became kind of a local hero after that, with his friends and his parents. But, Bud was a terrific guy, and he went to his grave believing that there was $100,000 in silver and gold still buried in that wreck, which I don't believe.
Let me just say here that Bud Bernard has some serious balls. Okay, first the guy body surfs in 10-foot waves, and it does seem his ocean experience was crucial because that same morning, a Navy machinist named J.W. Alexander attempted to swim out amongst the roaring waves and was never seen again. His body wasn't even found. But more to the point, Bud lied to a group of gangsters about their property and then continued to rob them over a series of months. His gamble paid off, though, because the owners preferred to stay as far away from the Monte Carlo as possible. The problem wasn't so much that they could be prosecuted for the gambling ship now that it was in San Diego County. Obviously, there was no gambling going on anymore, but authorities wanted to find the owners because they wanted somebody to be responsible for paying to clean up this big mess. a mess that was literally impossible to clean. It was a 300-foot-long concrete slab lodged amongst crashing waves. Correction, it is a 300-foot-long concrete slab lodged amongst crashing waves. It's still there. But nobody then, nor now, knows who the owners actually were. There was one gentleman who only went by the name McCullough who showed up about a month after the crash at the city clerk's office and tried to claim ownership for all the furnishings on board. But he didn't have any proof, and I couldn't find any evidence that his claim actually went anywhere. When asked what the city was going to do about this giant hazard now waiting in the surf, one San Diego city councilman simply said, quote, "Oh well, the Monte Carlo will be Coronado's fishing pier in 2 years," unquote. Obviously, that never came to pass. In the meantime, the wreckage became a feeding frenzy for scavengers, and during the Great Depression, everybody was a scavenger.
Another gentleman I know, Richard Kenny, he's the only one of these people that's still alive, but, Colonel Kenny's a retired Air Force, and spent most of World War II in a German POW camp, and he's a terrific guy, and also weaves a mean story, and he had told me about how he and his brother had raced down there in his older brother's Model A convertible, which was, as he said, a real chick magnet, and they drove right up on the beach, as people did back then, and they pulled up as close to the wreck as they could, jumped out, they saw the people running back and forth carrying things like roulette wheels and booze bottles and treasures that had washed ashore. As soon as the ship hit, the whole upper deck basically just launched up onto the beach and most of the contents with it. And so anyway, Bud said his brother ran down to where most of the people were, but Dick had seen this little gambler's table in the surf with the felt on the top, and he was trying to pull it in, but he said it was too heavy. So he said he began to kick at the drawer to get it to open, and when it did open, there were silver dollars just throughout this thing. So he said he'd loaded up his pockets, and he also got $100 or so in silver that day. But by the time they got back to their car, the tide had come in just enough to make the mud really soft. The tires of the Model A had sunk into the sand, and they couldn't get it out. So they had to walk across town to get their uncle, who had a bigger car and a big rope, and they came back to get the Model A out. But by then, the tide had come even further in, and the waves were breaking over the top of this guy's chick magnet. But they eventually got it out, and Dick said that his brother made him spend all summer. They took apart every single piece of that Model A, cleaned it, and put it back together until it was as good as new. And yet he said that probably the most valuable treasure on the beach that day was all of that wood that the company had just used to build a new upper deck on the Monte Carlo with a mirrored ceiling, where you can see some pictures in the book Film Noir, or Float. I'm sorry, but he said the wood was so valuable because, as I say, we were coming out of the Depression. It was a very tough time, and here was all these strips of long leaf, first growth Douglas fir that people just couldn't believe all this wood on the beach. So they began to bundle it up and haul it off, and there are more than a few houses in Coronado that had utilized some of that wood in their additions and remodeling or in their fencing, and so the ship had an afterlife of sorts here in Coronado. Another fellow, Ralph Mitchell, when he was a kid, he and his buddy were out fishing on their little skiff that night. They were out there drinking. It's what they were doing, drinking and fishing, because it was New Year's Eve, Mm-hmm. And he said they saw the ship coming in, and seas were pretty rough, and they stayed inside where it was safer. But then when it calmed down in the morning, they went out toward the vessel and got close enough where Ralph could climb the anchor chain and go up on the deck. And he said he'd seen old movies and read books that, when you found a ship afloat at sea, abandoned or on a shipwreck, you could claim it, and it would be yours under Admiralty law. And so Ralph says he stood as tall as he could, and he stomped his foot on the deck, and he said, "I, Ralph Mitchell, claim this vessel under the rules of Admiralty law." And he said suddenly there was this gruff, crusty old voice from down below that said, "Get the fuck off of my ship." Excuse my French. And he said he scared him so bad he climbed back down and got on his boat, and they ran like hell. But apparently there were two caretakers still on board that the Coast Guard didn't get off, and the Coast Guard cutter got off just about an hour later. But so Ralph didn't get to claim his ship.
The book that Joe referenced back there was called Noir Afloat by Ernest Marquez. And I'm not sure if I've referred to Mr. Marquez's work in an earlier episode or not, but his book was vital to the research of these shows. As you can probably tell, I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Joe. And I think we have enough time for just one final story. Perhaps you can tell us a story about what became of this dangerous hunk of concrete out in the surf. And if you would, Joe, could you also tie in the joys of working in the field of local history?
I got a phone call one day when I was running the museum here in town from a woman who said, "My name is Trudy Keys," and she sounded so old and so weak. And she said, I lived and was born and raised in Coronado, and now I live in Texas, but my heart is still in Coronado. And I read something you had read about the shipwreck Monte Carlo, and I've got a Monte Carlo story. And I thought, oh boy, you never get any work done in my business. You got to put your feet up and listen to the stories, because they only come knocking once. And if you don't listen, if you don't capture it right then, anything can happen. They can die, they can go away. You can get distracted or move on. And so that's been my rule of thumb always: is if someone has a good story about the history of Coronado, I just stop what I'm doing and let's hear it. And sure enough, she said that it was about 5 or 6 years after the ship came ashore in the 1940s, and it was right at the beginning of World War II. And she said she and her girlfriend were let out of school because of a heat wave here in Coronado, and they had no air conditioning then. So they let everybody out of school. So she and her girlfriend went down to the beach, down around where the shipwreck was. That was a popular place to play and hang out. She went in the water to cool off, and she got caught in a riptide. And the riptide sucked her out to the wreck immediately. And she realized that she was going to get sucked all the way out to sea. So she struggled like crazy to get closer to the wreck, and she got up to the old anchor chain and the barnacle encrusted hull, which is all rusted out now and everything, and rust weepers dripping on the side. And she said she clung to every little protrusion that she could off that hull, but she was losing her hold, and she was going to get sucked out. And she said a young man who was a busboy at the La Avenida restaurant, she recognized him. He swam out and tried to get her, but he couldn't get her, and he got sucked out to sea and disappeared. Whoa. And she started to cry, and people were gathered on the beach, and nobody knew what to do. And then another young man, Dexter Lenoir, who she said was every girl in high school's dream. He was the football star, and he swam out, and Dexter got her by the arm and managed to get the two of them up the anchor chain up onto the deck of what was left of the ship. But the waves were so big, crashing around them, that about every couple of seconds, a wave would just crash completely over the deck of the ship and just throw them onto their knees on this really now weather-beaten and really dangerous, surface of this deck. And she said the third time that it happened, they came up sputtering, and it wasn't just the two of them; there were three of them. The busboy from the La Avenida had somehow been washed back up onto the ship. So the three of them were just huddled there, scared to death, didn't know what to do. And a Coast Guard cutter finally came and got them off and took them back around into San Diego Bay. And she said, there's a picture of me the next day in the San Diego Union. And she sent it to me, and no kidding, there she was, this cute little blonde girl with bird legs, and these two other boys are all shaking from the cold and the exhaustion, and they've been covered with Coast Guard peacoats, and so she used to tell everybody that I'm a survivor from the shipwreck, Monte Carlo, and I thought that was a cute little tale that she told.
You can still see the wreckage of the Monte Carlo today. It's about a half a mile south of the Hotel del Coronado, right in front of some tall apartment buildings called the Coronado Shores. However, you have to go at super low tide. I went at the lowest tide possible during daylight hours on the few days that I was there, and we could only barely make out the point where the waves were breaking a little bit early. However, there are plenty of pictures that have been shared with me, and I'll share them with you at bearflaglibation.blogspot.com. All that's left, really, is a massive concrete block in the recognizable shape of a ship. Since Trudy Keys' day, the Coast Guard has periodically went out at extreme low tides and shaved down all of the sharp metal edges. Time and the Pacific Ocean have nearly smoothed out everything else. Although, every so often, the wreckage will take a chunk out of some surfer who is unlucky enough to wipe out just above the old gambling ship. The Monte Carlo also resurfaces every few years to capture the attention of hopeful treasure hunters.
Every time I do a story or an interview or a TV spot, or usually on the anniversary of the wreck on New Year's Day, then for a week after, all you see is this army of little fat men with metal detectors walking around trying to find their, gambler's gold, or silver.
The same morning that my mom, Anthony, and I had our failed expedition out to find the last physical remnant of the gambling ships, my brother showed me a 2010 article about a diver who apparently had just pulled 400,000 silver dollars out of the ruin. I said something stupid to the effect of, "Wow, after all these years, the Monte Carlo is still paying out." But after we mentioned this to Sarah Dickey at the Coronado Museum, she laughed and pointed out that the publication date of the article was April 1st. The Monte Carlo was definitely through paying out. In fact, it was pretty rare that she or the Monfalcone or the Joanna Smith or the Rose Isle or any of the others ever paid out. The gambling ships were really never more than a fantasy that fed on hopes and desires and the aspirational delusion that you were the one person who could beat the odds. You alone had the capacity to transcend reality and come home with a handful of cash. Next time, we'll be focusing the episode on a man who personifies this aspirational delusion as both the gambling ship's greatest owner and the biggest gambler on the idea of gambling ships. He's been at the edges of this story all along and is about to take center stage, not just on the gambling ship venture, but also in the birth of Las Vegas. He's also the perfect person to tie all of this together and see how it ends up, and lets us discuss what the whole damn thing means to the lasting effect of California culture. So please join us next month for the fourth and final installment on this series, with the rise and fall of Tony Cordero and the rise of Las Vegas. Thank you so much to Joe Ditler for lending us his time, knowledge, and voice. Also, thank you to Sarah Dickey at the Coronado Museum of History and Art for putting me in touch with Joe and allowing me access to their material on the SS Monte Carlo. Another huge thank you to Christy Fisher, my aunt, who not only got me free reign of the Historical Society of Long Beach archives, but also helped me pore over all this material just as enthusiastically as myself. And thanks to my other research assistants, Anthony Lukens and Luann Burton. Finally, in the last episode, I forgot to send a shout out to my friend Cindy Ramirez, who gave us the proper Spanish pronunciation in her sexy, raspy voice. And thank you so much for listening. I know the edit of this episode may have come out a little rough because I've never edited an interview before. And it also probably shows that half of this episode was read under the influence of bourbon, and the other half under the influence of strong black tea. If you can find a bartender who knows how to make a good one, enjoy an old-fashioned this week. And you get bonus points if it also happens to be a place with an outdoor area that allows dogs.